In 1951, a rancher named Waldo Wilcox bought 4,200 acres of hard grazing land in the Book Cliffs of eastern Utah. Along with the cattle range, he had bought a canyon full of thousand-year-old villages, granaries on the ledges, pottery lying loose in the dirt. He locked the gate and told almost nobody for 50 years. That is where this list begins. That canyon is in Utah, and it is far from the strangest thing anyone has pulled out of the ground there. That place makes this list. So do 11 others. A cave floor, buried under a layer of Ice Age mammoth dung. A 9-ton block of sandstone that paleontologists refuse to break open. A village that was excavated, recorded, and then fed into the roadbed of an interstate. Stick with us to the end, because that story is number 188 bare human footprints on a live Air Force bombing range, each marked with a small orange flag. This channel goes looking for the place's history left behind. If that is your kind of thing, subscribe. Today we are counting down 12 ancient discoveries in Utah that should not exist. Number 12. The St. George Dinosaur Discovery Site at Johnson Farm. The retired optometrist who flipped over a rock. St. George sits in the Red Rock corner of southwestern Utah, and like a lot of Sunbelt cities, it has been growing outward for decades. On the 26th of February, 2000, a retired optometrist named Sheldon Johnson was leveling a hilly patch of his own land with a track hoe, getting it ready to build on. He pulled off the soft sedimentary layers and hit a thick bed of sandstone. When the blocks came loose and flipped, one of them had a dinosaur footprint on it, preserved in 3 dimensions, crisp enough that Johnson first assumed he was looking at an entire fossilized animal. He was looking at the edge of an early Jurassic lake. Geologists call it Lake Dixie. The rock is roughly 200 million years old, and it holds thousands of tracks across at least 25 separate layers, including the largest and best preserved known collection of dinosaur swim tracks, scrape marks left by claws touching bottom while the animal floated. Johnson could have finished the job and sold the lots. Instead, he and his wife Laverna gave the tracks away and helped hand the land to the city, which built a museum on top of them. Behind that museum sit hundreds of boxes covering track blocks that would not fit inside. An overflow lot of Jurassic footprints crated up in the Utah sun. You can park, walk in, and stand on a Jurassic shoreline in the time it takes to buy a coffee. Number 11. Bechan Cave, the room full of Ice Age dung. The name is Navajo. It translates as big feces, and it is not a joke at anyone's expense. It is a plain description. Bechan Cave is a large alcove in Navajo sandstone in the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, in the Slick Rock country of southern Utah. Its floor holds a layer of dung measured in the hundreds of cubic meters, laid down by Columbian mammoths, animals larger than African elephants. 2 individual boluses have been radiocarbon dated to roughly 11,600 and 12,900 years ago. They are comparable in size and plant content to modern elephant dung, packed with grass stems. Here's what makes this different from a normal fossil site. Bones tell you an animal existed. Dung tells you what it ate, what the vegetation was, and what season it died in. Researchers have since pulled mammoth DNA out of this deposit, which is remarkable given that no diagnostic mammoth bones were found in it at all. Only the dung and long coarse hair. Ground sloths used the alcove too. So did bighorn sheep or mule deer, rabbits, horses, and Harrington's mountain goat. None of it rotted because the alcove is bone dry. A research team documented the deposit in 1983. One of the large mammoth coprolites was lying next to a pit dug by path hunters. Looters had been in there digging for artifacts and had stepped straight over the most valuable thing in the room. There is no trail, no sign, and no visitor center. Nobody watching this will ever see it, and that is probably the point. Number 10. The Pilling Figurines. the one that came back in a box. Around the year 1000, a Fremont artist made 11 small clay people, men and women, 4 to 6 inches tall, each one individually decorated with applied clay ornaments and traces of red, buff, and black paint. They were not buried, and they were not broken. They were arranged together in a sandstone niche in a side canyon of Range Creek, and left. They sat there for roughly 950 years. In 1950, a rancher named Clarence Pilling, out with his brothers Art and Woodrow and 2 ranch hands, looked into an overhang and saw them. At Harvard's Peabody Museum, the anthropologist Noel Morse studied the set and concluded all 11 had been made by the same hands. They were later dated to roughly the year 1000. Then they went on the road, displayed in Utah banks, courthouses, and a hotel, until they were something close to a state symbol. Somewhere around 1973, figurine number 2 stopped coming back. Nobody noticed for years, because another figurine had broken into 2 pieces, so the case still held 11 objects. In November 2011, a box arrived at the office of Utah State University anthropologist Bonnie Pitblotto. Inside was a figurine and a typed note from someone who said they had come into possession of it decades earlier and had always hoped to return it. The sender was never identified. A team, including the Utah State Crime Lab, went to work basketry, imprint analysis, scanning electron microscopy, X-ray fluorescence. What clinched it was a coat of lacquer called Alvar, applied to all 11 figurines at the Peabody back in 1950. Whoever took it had stolen an object carrying an invisible receipt for exactly where it had been. All 11 are back together now, in a small museum in a Utah coal town. Number 9. Parowan Gap. The notch that catches the sun. Start with the geology, because the geology is why anyone came here. Ka. In Iron County in southwestern Utah, a range of low hills called the Red Hills was pushing up out of the valley floor. Our river was already running across that line, and it cut downward faster than the hills rose. The Utah Geological Survey describes it as a buzzsaw slicing a groove into a log rising from underneath. Then the water left. What remained is a narrow stone doorway cut clean through a mountain, visible for miles across open sagebrush country. From out on the flats at certain times of year, the setting sun drops directly into that doorway. People carved the walls of that notch for over 1,000 years. The site is on the National Register of Historic Places and holds one of the most concentrated collections of petroglyphs in the western United States. The largest carving is known as the zipper glyph, and nothing quite like it is known anywhere else. What it means is genuinely contested. Researchers working from an astronomical reading argue its outline matches the profile of the gap itself, and that its notches record solar intervals. The Paiute Indian tribe of Utah reads it differently, as the record of a migration and of a great leader, a journey through famine, drought, ice, and heat. Here's the detail that stops people cold. Working from the shape of that one carving, researchers went out onto the empty flats east of the gap and found ancient stone cairns, positioned to mark exactly where a person should stand to watch the sun set into the notch on the right day. 19th century settlers carved their names into the same walls. Everyone who comes here seems to want to leave something behind. Number 8. The Cleveland-Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry. The Jurassic murder scene nobody can solve. The problem with this site is that it is ecologically impossible. In any living ecosystem and in any normal fossil bed, plant eaters vastly outnumber meat eaters. At Cleveland-Lloyd, in the San Rafael swell of Emery County, the ratio is inverted. Roughly 10,000 bones have come out of the ground here, from at least 70 individual dinosaurs, across a minimum of 9 genera, and over 60% of them belong to a single predator, Allosaurus fragilis. That is a predator-to-prey ratio of about 3 to 1. More than 85% of the Allosaurus are juveniles or subadults. Cowboys working the swell in the late 1,800 seconds knew there were bones out there. University of Utah geologists came in 1927 and hauled away about 800 of them. In 1939, a Utah native studying at Princeton, William Lee Stokes, brought a team back. A Philadelphia lawyer named Malcolm Lloyd wrote a $10,000 check for the 1941 dig, and the site took his name. The obvious answer was a predator trap. Animals mired in mud, their distress drawing in more predators, who also got stuck. But real predator traps leave signatures: sheared teeth, trampled, broken bones, gnaw marks. At Cleveland-Lloyd, those are rare or absent. One published model proposes the pond became so laden with rotting flesh and minerals that scavengers simply would not touch it. Fossils from this one hillside are now on display in more than 65 museums worldwide. A large share of every Allosaurus the public has ever seen came out of a single unexplained hole in Emery County. A mounted skeleton nicknamed Al has stood over the quarry since June of 1963, waiting for somebody to explain him. Number 7. The Utahraptor Megablock. The 9-ton rock they are afraid to break open. The dig that produced the largest Utahraptor find in history began with a report of a human arm sticking out of a hill. That is what brought Utah's state paleontologist, James Kirkland, out to a patch of sandstone on state land north of Arches National Park around 2001. What a geologist named Matt Stykes had actually found was a bone, and beneath it, a mass grave. About 125 million years ago, near the shore of an early Cretaceous lake, saturated sand gave way and behaved like quicksand. A plant-eating iguanodont went in and could not get out. A large, struggling animal is an advertisement, and Utahraptor came for it. Adults and juveniles, one after another, and the trap took them too. Then the sand collapsed and sealed the whole scene. As Kirkland puts it, what killed them is what buried them, which is why they are so intact. The Utah Geological Survey worked parts of 12 field seasons at the site. What they exposed was so densely packed with skeletons that breaking it into manageable pieces risked cutting straight through, the answer to a decades-old argument about whether these animals hunted in packs. So, in 2014, they built a wooden frame, dragged the entire 9-ton block out with a track hoe, and put it on a truck. 18,000 pounds of rock, moved whole. Over 3,500 hours of preparation have gone into it, exposing hundreds of bones from only a small portion of the block. In 2020, they pulled out the first complete adult shoulder ever found, and a sickle claw 2.5 inches long. The preservation is good enough that they are hoping for feather impressions. Somewhere inside that rock, a hunt is still going on. Number 6. Danger Cave. The cave that tried to kill the people studying it, it used to have a gentler name. Archaeologists called it Hands and Knees Cave because the entrance was choked with debris and crawling was the only way in. Then, in 1941, during the first serious excavation, a large rock broke free from the lip of the entrance and came down onto the ground the crew had been kneeling on. They had walked out for lunch minutes earlier. Nobody was hurt. The dig was abandoned, and the cave got a more honest name. The rocks are still lying there. Danger Cave sits about a mile east of Wendover in Towle County, looking out over the Bonneville Salt Flats. It was carved by the waves of Lake Bonneville, the inland sea that once covered much of Utah. When the lake dropped, the alcove was left dry above the flats, and people moved in almost immediately and kept coming back for roughly 11,000 years as a seasonal camp, never more than 15 to 30 people at a time. Because western Utah is one of the driest places on the continent, nothing rotted. Cordage, basketry, netting, leather, wooden tools, textiles, chewed food. It is one of the few places on Earth where the perishable things survived. From 1949 to 1953, Jesse Jennings of the University of Utah dug a stratified trench through the whole sequence and gave the region's earliest inhabitants a name. It became a National Historic Landmark in 1961. Half a mile up the hill is another ancient cave with rock art inside. In 1943, soldiers stationed at Wendover on the Manhattan Project poured a concrete floor into the back of it and used it as a dance hall. It has been called Jukebox Cave ever since. Two caves, half a mile apart, one nearly killed the scientists, and the other one hosted dances. We opened this video with Waldo Wilcox and his locked canyon. That story is coming up at number 3, and it gets stranger. If you are enjoying the deep dive so far, drop a thumbs up, and let us know in the comments which of these you had never heard of. Number 5, Five Finger Ridge. The village, the Interstate 8. In November 1983, bulldozers were cutting apart a hillside in Clear Creek Canyon. Building an interstate through a canyon takes enormous quantities of fill dirt, and Five Finger Ridge was conveniently located. The village was found because local elementary school students told Brigham Young University archaeologists there was pottery up on that ridge and dents in the ground where buildings had collapsed. By the time the archaeologists got there, the heavy equipment had already started. What they were standing on was the largest Fremont settlement ever identified. Over 100 separate structures, hundreds of thousands of artifacts. A community of around 100 people at its height, occupied on and off across nearly 1,000 years. What followed was 2 seasons of the fastest large-scale excavation in Utah's history, 1984 and 1985. Everything documented and boxed against a construction schedule. Then the ridge went into the roadbed. The northern end of it is simply gone. In 1985, the Utah legislature created Fremont Indian State Park as a kind of compensation, and the museum opened in 1987. It holds everything that came off the ridge. Outside it, more than 500 rock art panels still line the walls of Clear Creek Canyon, and at least 10 Fremont sites survive inside the park boundary. You can walk the trails today and hear canyon wind in the cottonwoods with the whoosh of interstate traffic underneath it the whole time. It is the easiest site on this list to reach, and it is easy to reach because of the thing that destroyed it. Number 4, the Great Gallery in Horseshoe Canyon. The Holy Ghost. 20 life-sized figures float across 60 meters of sandstone wall in an alcove 8 to 12 meters above a desert creek. The largest is over 2 meters tall. They have no arms and no legs. Some have huge hollow eyes. Some appear to be holding snakes. Some are surrounded by small attendant figures, like a crowd. Edward Abbey described them as sinister supernatural beings, gods from the underworld, hovering in space. This is the type site for an entire artistic tradition. Archaeologists named the Barrier Canyon style after this canyon, using its older name. And for decades, everyone agreed the paintings were extremely old. Accepted range was 2,000 to 4,000 years, and some argued 7,000 or 8,000. Among the oldest artworks in North America, the trouble is that rock art is almost impossible to date. Pigment rarely holds enough carbon for radiocarbon dating, and into that vacuum went decades of confident assumption. Then a geologist noticed that a slab bearing part of the Holy Ghost group had cleaved off the wall and landed face down. That changed everything because a fallen rock can be read like a stopwatch. How long was that surface exposed to sunlight before it fell? Here's the wild part. They dated the fallen rock face using optically stimulated luminescence. They dated the quartz sediment it landed on. And they radiocarbon dated a single leaf that had been caught underneath the slab when it came down. 3 completely different methods. All 3 returned the same answer, about 900 years. The 2014 study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, put the panel at roughly 900 to 2,000 years old, thousands of years younger than anyone wanted. One co-author argued that placed the art in a period of real upheaval. As farming populations pushed into hunter-gatherer country, the finding was formally challenged in the same journal. Critics pointed out that the canyon was hardly untouched, a road was cut into it in 1928. The 1952 uranium boom opened more routes, and people with dynamite had been coming and going for decades. The original team published a reply defending the results. There is no road to the panel. Whoever painted it walked in, and so does everyone who has argued about it since. Number 3. Range Creek Canyon. The canyon one man locked for 50 years. Waldo Wilcox bought 4,200 acres of hardscrabble grazing land in the Glyphs in 1951 and discovered he had also bought a museum. Fremont villages, granaries tucked onto cliff ledges, rock art panels, pottery and arrowheads lying loose on the ground in a canyon that had gone essentially untouched since the people who lived there left around 700 years earlier. An expedition had recorded a handful of sites there back in 1931, but private ownership shut the door on any follow-up for over 70 years. The usual assumption about a rancher with ruins on his land is that the ruins get looted. Wilcox inverted it. He did not publicize the canyon, did not sell artifacts, did not invite universities in. He locked the gate and ran off anyone who came up the road, and he did that for 50 years. He admits freely that he picked up an arrowhead if he saw one, but nobody dug potholes. And that is the entire difference. He sold the ranch for $2.5 million, and in 2004 the news broke, international coverage. Smithsonian, National Geographic, the European press. Archaeologists called it the most pristine archaeological area in the lower 48 states. The preservation is hard to overstate. Intact sandals, woven baskets, strands of ancient human hair, granaries that still held 1,000-year-old corn. Over 450 sites have been recorded, and officials believe that is a fraction of what is there. As of early reporting, less than 10% of the property had even been surveyed, with artifacts still lying exactly where they were dropped. The Fremont built granaries so high on those cliff walls that when Wilcox pointed toward an arch on the skyline and told a University of Utah anthropologist there was a village up there, the anthropologist assumed he was being teased by an old cowboy. He went and looked anyway. Wilcox was right. Excavation there is still deliberately minimal. Record it, do not dig it. Leave it for archaeologists who have not been born yet. Wilcox spent 50 years being the reason nobody knew. Now, the problem is that everybody does. Number 2. The Promontory Caves. 300 pairs of shoes. In 1930, an archaeologist named Julian Stewart went to 2 caves on the north shore of the Great Salt Lake because he was worried about looting. What came out of the floor was one of the most complete hunter-gatherer records in western North America. Hundreds of well-worn moccasins, along with mittens, bison, rope fragments, bows, arrows, pottery, bone, and stone tools, cordage, and gaming pieces. Roughly 250 moccasins and moccasin parts went to the University of Utah. Estimates of the full assemblage run to around 350, and Stewart saw the problem immediately. They were not Great Basin footwear. They were subarctic Canadian footwear, of a style made and worn more than 1,500 kilometers to the north. He drew the radical conclusion. These were Apachean ancestors, people in the middle of one of the longest migrations in North American history, moving south from the Canadian subarctic toward what would become Navajo and Apache country. Then he moved on. The Depression came, then the war, and the moccasins sat in open wooden trays in a Salt Lake City museum for about 80 years, while scholars argued inconclusively about Navajo and Apache origins. Jack Ives of the University of Alberta and Joel Janetsky of Brigham Young University finally dated them. The results clustered tightly between 1250 and 1290, a window so narrow it suggests 1 or 2 human generations in those caves, and then gone. That is roughly 400 years earlier than some archaeologists had placed early Apacheans. In 2011, the 2 of them started new excavations with the permission of the landowners, George and Kumaroa Chornos, and the new work supported everything Stewart had said. Then, in 2021, Isotope work on the leather itself. Most of the bison hide came from animals raised around the Great Salt Lake. But one ankle wrap on one moccasin carried a chemical signature from an animal that had lived 700 to 800 kilometers to the south. Ives reads that as scouting, people going ahead, or word coming back from relatives who already had. Here's the thing. A large proportion of those moccasins are children's. This was not a war party or a hunting expedition. This was families with kids on the move. You can hold the worn-through shoe of a specific child who walked across a continent 700 years ago. Number 1. The Ice Age Trackway on the Utah Test and Training Range. Flatness in every direction, white and gray alkaline mudflat running unbroken to the horizon, no vegetation, no shade, no water, 100 degrees and more in July. One of the most barren settings in the United States. There is nothing to look at. Then, out on the empty dirt, a scatter of small orange pin flags. Each flag marks a bare human footprint. The silence is total, except for wind and every so often the sound of military aircraft overhead. This is a live weapons range. In July 2022, an archaeologist named Darren Duke was driving Cornell researcher Thomas Urban across the range toward a hearth site. Urban looked out the window and saw discolored patches on the ground and recognized them instantly because he had spent years looking at exactly that at White Sands, which holds the earliest known human footprints in the Americas. They are called ghost tracks. They surface for a short time when the moisture is right, and then they vanish again. They stop the truck. The next day, they came back with ground-penetrating radar, and the radar found many more prints that were invisible at the surface, 88 footprints in total. Duke spent the following days lying on his belly in the dirt, excavating with extreme care, confirming what they had. Barefoot adults and children, roughly 5 to 12 years old. 12,000 years ago, this was not a desert. It was marshland, open water, reeds, waterfowl, the wet green edge of a retreating ice age. A group of people walked across a shallow, flooded flat. Sand filled in behind their heels as they went, and a layer of mud underneath held the shape. Then the marshes dried out, around 9,500 years ago, and the wind started stripping sediment off the flats, and for the next 10 millennia, nothing happened at all. Researchers assess the prints as likely more than 12,000 years old, based on the fact that there have been no wetland conditions here for at least 10,000 years. About half a mile away sits a hearth Duke had found back in 2015. He describes it as a little black smudge on an open mudflat. It contained nearly 2,000 bones, mostly duck, with cut marks. Charred willow wood dated it to roughly 12,300 years ago, and in among it, 4 charred seeds of wild desert tobacco. That is the oldest evidence of human tobacco use found anywhere on Earth. The previous record was nicotine residue in a pipe from Alabama, 3,300 years old. This pushed it back by around 9,000 years. Someone sat by a willow fire, ate duck, and chewed tobacco at the end of the Ice Age. And the only reason any of it survived is that in the 1,940 seconds, the U.S. Air Force fenced off this entire stretch of desert to drop bombs on it, and kept everyone else out ever since. Duke's own assessment is that an active weapons range functions in many ways as a preserve. Nobody watching this will ever stand there. Most days there is nothing to see anyway. The tracks come up when the ground is right, and then they go back under. A family walked through shallow water, and the water is gone, and the flags are the only thing left standing up out of the dirt. There are more of these than we could fit. Utah keeps producing them, and a dozen good ones did not make the cut. My personal favorite is Danger Cave, because the whole history of Great Basin archaeology comes out of a hole that nearly killed the first man who dug in it. Which of these surprised you most, and what did we miss? Subscribe, and we will go find the next one.